Hello and welcome to another Office 365 Hours. My name is Christian Buckley. I'm the Brand and Alliance Director at AvePoint and a Microsoft MVP and RD. And I'm joined today by Todd Klindt. He is a SharePoint MVP, a longtime SharePoint MVP, and a consultant with Sympraxis Consulting, and a self-proclaimed computer nerd. Good morning, Todd.
Good morning, Christian. Thanks for having me. Thanks for bringing me in.
Yeah, I know that when I think of computer nerds, I do think of you. You're high on the list. So
I'm just glad you think of me at all. Yeah, I was talking to a buddy of mine this weekend, and it was a kid that I had grown up with, and we were talking about how 35 years ago, being a nerd was not a good thing at all. You spent a lot of time in lockers and trash cans and stuff like that. Today is not a bad gig. Like, there are worse things. So I'm retaking the word. I'm claiming my nerdness and being proud of it.
maybe someday the same can be true about people that live and breathe inside of migrations, because that's what we're going to be talking about today. The topic of the good, the bad, and the ugly on migrating to Microsoft 365. Well, this is a space I know. So, I mean, I got to know you in the admin IT pro space, and there's a lot of topics around that. But when I got involved, some of the first projects when I joined Microsoft in 2006, some of the first projects internally were migrating. Then it was, from the 2003 SharePoint environment to 2007. We were getting ready for that to go live and everything. What's changed in this space? I mean, broadly looking at migrations since the early days of SharePoint, what's changed?
Yeah, so I can proudly say that I have migrated every version of SharePoint to the next version. My first SharePoint farm was a SharePoint Team Services 2001 farm.
Hmm.
By farm, I mean, machine sitting under my desk. And so I have gone through all of the different iterations. And so we could sit back, guys our age, Christian, like to sit back and wax nostalgically about how things, but I can tell you that the process has gotten a lot better. Um, Along the way. So in early versions of SharePoint, and some kids, ask your parents or your grandparents about this. When you did migrations, you could actually upgrade in place. So you could have like a SharePoint 2003 server,
Right.
SharePoint 2007 right on top of it.
And that was always recommended, highly recommended of course.
And the great thing about that was if it didn't work, there was no decision making. You just wiped that drive and started scratch. There was but so we lost a couple of those, and then there was the side by side migration that we used to have for a while. So a long time ago, Microsoft decided that they could only do one thing well when it came to migrations, and that was database attach. And so they kind of stuck with that, and we've had that for a while. The types, what I see, the tools have gotten better from Microsoft, the out of the box stuff. Fascinating to me is over the nearly 20 years that I've been doing SharePoint migrations now is watching the different waves of migrations that have happened. And we can talk about, so you and I were there before we were SharePoint before SharePoint was cool.
Right.
Had SharePoint got a little cool in 2007, but 2010 was where
2010 was, well, that's where In Excess came to America, their breakout album. They had the big hit. They had some other minor hits before that, but that was, it was, yeah. So I mean, it's looking back over that, and you talk about like the waves of migration, because it really has been not only it's been an iterative process. I mean, Microsoft learned from it. Partners learn from the experience of the migrations. So what are some of the trends that you've seen in migration?
Yeah, it's been fascinating. So we saw for 2010 there wasn't a lot, but the migrations were people who had done 2007 and done a lot of crazy things with it, because that's what you had to do to get one of the so I like to tell people, when I would install SharePoint on-prem for a customer, I would always get two questions, and always in this order. The first question is, why is it so slow? And the second, how can I make SharePoint not look like SharePoint? So
Right.
ways, and Microsoft, bless their hearts, every version of SharePoint, you did it differently.
Of course. Oh yeah.
It changed every time.
Apps and everything else. Right. Yes.
Great opportunities for guys like you and me to completely relearn everything we knew about our craft. But for migrations, the first wave was really that, trying to get people migrated from 2007 with all these heavy customizations, and we were still learning how to use the product and what it could do. And is it okay to have 10,000 documents in a document library? Who knew?
Yeah.
And so things like that, figuring that out. And as it's gone along now, I started focusing on cloud things. Boy, I don't know, 7-8 years ago is when I finally I feel like in my peer group, the MVPs and all that, I was one of the last people clutching on to my on-prem servers.
I don't know. There's a group of those because there's I mean, as you know, I mean, so I've done and AvePoint was one of the sponsors, but my previous my standalone company, and I did consulting. I did a bunch of research projects, and AvePoint was a sponsor. About a dozen different ISVs and partners were sponsors, but Microsoft was the lead sponsor of this research looking into how many organizations are planning to stay for the midterm to long term on-prem or hybrid environments. And the response rate, we had tremendous response, and the numbers surprised Microsoft at the time. That was 2017, but they came back and they kind of adjusted their profile. They said, in fact, you remember a bunch of their messaging was also around get into the cloud as soon as possible. You're a fool if you're not in the cloud. And they actually walked it back from that and said, we do not have a plan to move away from on-prem. So I'll just say this again for those that are out there. There is no timeline that has been communicated to anybody in any degree about on-prem going away. In fact, they're still talking about the next version for on-prem. I don't know what the time frame is. I don't think they've discussed that, Todd, that you're aware of.
My memory is that they said the subscription edition would be the final one, but there would be, packs and things like that.
Right. And then, yeah, I don't know that. Right. Yeah.
I remember. So I think it was with SharePoint Conference 2012. Like there were a bunch of us that were pretty sure they were just going to say SharePoint was dead. Like there was.
Right. Right.
But I feel like for our peer group, I was one of the last people to get into the cloud because I really liked my servers. And I, like a lot of admins, I wasn't sure what the hell I was going to do once those servers weren't there for me to click next and finish on. Like that's kind of my bread and butter. And so then the migration trends kind of work towards moving people to the cloud. And it's been interesting watching that because there was the early adopters that came in, and we're among friends here. Office 365 at the beginning was kind of a rough platform. Those folks that moved in, they suffered for that.
No. It was an opportunity to learn, Todd.
Reevaluate. And so there was a lot of that. And then after the early adopters came through, then you saw a lot of the mainstream people who had SharePoint farms move into there. And then you started seeing people, at least the way what I saw, was people who didn't have a Microsoft footprint starting to migrate non-SharePoint things into Office 365. And kind of the latest wave I've been seeing now is I'm still seeing a bunch of that, but I'm seeing people who have on-prem servers that are running 2013, 2016. Mm-hmm. Because of maintenance on those servers running away, and their IT department finally looking back and going, I don't want to buy another set of servers, and I don't want to new software. So I tried to give up on the on-prem work because there's just so many fun things to do in Office 365. But a couple of customers that I really love have on-prem footprints now that want to move to the cloud. I'm like, all right, for you guys, one more time, SharePoint 2016, SharePoint 2013.
There for so many years, the average number of SharePoint versions was 2.5. And so there, that for a long time, I don't know what that number is today. I have to believe that it's gotten smaller. There might be one other version of on-prem and then you've got the cloud components, but I don't have any data around that. But, one other kind of trend that I saw, and this was, having worked for a number of ISVs building migration solutions. So I've worked for 4 in total, that through acquisitions and other stuff. But now at AvePoint, but one of the most important developments that came with around the same time as the 2010 release was the pre-migration analysis. How much do you rely on that? I know Microsoft has some, and we'll get into tooling here in a second and what Microsoft has done. How important has that been for your migrations?
Yeah, so that was the old pre-upgrade pre-upgrade check tool, and I think 2007 had that coming from 2003. I don't.
It did, but it wasn't. But then the ISV started building even more comprehensive reviewing, and well. So anyway, but that's, I don't know how much you utilize those.
So I use a bunch of them, and it kind of varies. One of the things that I will do when I was doing on-prem migrations is, since there was very little cost to just hooking that database up and seeing what happened. Once I do a quick sniff of the source farm and go, doesn't look like it'd be that tough, and we just drop that database in the new farm and just see what happened. And as the product matured, the error messaging got better and better. Loved it, and I can't remember the versions, but like in 2013, when you would attach a database or test a database, it would tell you you've got 600 web parts that aren't referenced, but it wouldn't tell you where they were.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Why are you so nitpicky, Todd? I mean, I know. Yeah.
And they added that whole, show rows and all that kind of stuff. So
yeah.
A lot and I remember, and this was a long time ago, Shane and I were looking at a migration, and this was, we're plotting it out, we're scoping this thing, and I can't remember, it was like 2003 to 2007 or 2007 to 2010. We're like, well, we're going to spend 20 hours looking at this, coming up with a plan, and then testing's going to be however many hours, and then the migration. And it was like a 40-hour project or something. And Shane's like, well, let's just attach the database and see what happens. And we did, and it just upgraded. And so it was done in like 2 hours. And so we're like, all right, so, how about that local sports team? So a lot of times there's some value in just trying it, but I absolutely run all the different tools. And, Microsoft recently deprecated or removed SharePoint 2010 workflows from Office 365, and you could find those with that they had a tool that would let you do those things. And there's just so little effort that goes into testing those things, and just every piece of information you have helps that process. So I'm all for those tools, first party, third party, just.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting point too, is that, so Microsoft has made some investments in tools. So they acquired Mover. I remember when that announcement was made, and of course, all of the ISVs were like, what? Excuse me? What's going on now? And yet it was like talking about before we started recording here, is like, I know our services teams and a lot of our partners spend a lot of time working with customers that were not able to quite do the job with those tools that are out there. So like, what kind of tools do you use? What like the full gamut of as that, what goes into a migration?
Yeah, and it's funny because I really love the complicated migrations, the one where I have to use all my tools and all my tricks. But so Microsoft, for free, they have the SharePoint migration tool, the cloud thing, and then they bought Mover.io, so you've got those. I don't use those a lot. They have those are great, and Microsoft kind of has to have a free option. Like the market would skewer them if they didn't have.
Well, they did for years, which is why they made the move, right? Yeah.
But there's just so many things that trip those up. There's so many limitations. So normally when I'm talking to a customer, I'll suggest a third-party tool. Those come with cost, and so some customers push back on that. And I've got the web pages ready where I can say, well, here's the things that you have that Mover won't do. Here's the so they're good talking points for that. Almost all the migrations that I do use a third-party tool of some variety, and they all just add so much, flexibility or benefit. I do that a lot. Another thing, and it pains me to give credit, but there's I think one of your previous guests, I think you had Vesa on a couple mornings ago, and he is kind of the godfather now of the PNP movement, the practices. And I'm a big fan of the PNP PowerShell for all things. I use that for all kinds of things. But I've also written a ton of tools that help with migration, just all kinds of little weird things. So a great example of one is I'm doing a migration for a customer now, and their farm is pretty big, 1.5 terabytes, and it's been, I think it's SharePoint 2013, been using it for a while. And I had a problem with moving some data over because they had a few thousand records that didn't have information in some columns because these records were 8-10 years old. But now there's a bunch of columns required because their business practices have gotten refined and all that. So the third-party tool can't move those files over because it doesn't have all the required data. And so, and this happens in a bunch of document libraries. So PNP comes to the rescue. I just write this little script that goes out to every document library in a web, removes all the required fields, and poof, now everything moves over. So there's just all kinds of little problems like that. So the PNP, I definitely use that stuff all the time.
Well, something, Todd. I mean, so I mean, I get it. So you have the depth, the experience. You've gone through. You've developed your own scripts and tools. You leverage third-party tools. You sometimes, well, you don't really, but in theory, you could leverage some of the Microsoft, the free tools and things that are out there. But with all of that, it kind of begs the question: like, is migration really something that most customers can take on, or is it require an expert to be brought in? Or let me ask a different way, because obviously you have some organizations that maybe they have the technical capability to go in and to come up to speed on that and do that. And so I think it's a whole nother discussion you and I could probably have of whether migration, which is traditionally viewed as a one-time activity, I think of it as there's going to be an ongoing need, because you'll reorg, you'll change things, through mergers and acquisitions, other companies come in, other data sources. I mean, change is constant, and there will be a need for moving data around, because I'm sure that you're going to go design your intranet perfectly the first time.
Like everybody does.
Of course.
Because you would think, or at least I would think, that when somebody like Sympraxis comes in to a customer to do a migration, that we're working with IT. But we're not all the time. I would say, and then not just migrations, but probably half or more of the projects that we do are not with IT. And migration is part of that, because you've got some business unit that's driving this, that says, hey, we need the security functionality that only Office 365 gives us, and it's the legal department or whatever.
Yeah.
So in those cases, those people don't have the skill set, or it's a smaller company that just doesn't have an IT department. They have an IT department, but he also runs the printers and the lights and all that. One of the customers I'm working with now, they've got a great IT department, but they don't migrate SharePoint all the time like I do. So yeah. Folks are clearly smart enough to do it and clearly can get up to speed, but having me around in like a consulting just speeds things along a lot.
Well, I think you just nailed that. Like that's another trend around migration, as I think in the time that you and I have been in this space, that has changed, where it has moved out of IT over to the business side of that. That's one major shift that's happened with the cloud. So the business is able to go to make the decision around that. So,
yep, yeah, and I think I've always been so one of the reasons that I really liked SharePoint way back in the day was it allowed me to push a lot of things off onto the users. So once I spun SharePoint up and gave them a site collection, I could go back to playing solitaire and emailing my mom and doing all that stuff. And that was a really great thing. And I think that has just gotten, a million times better these days. So yeah, it's a lot of business units that and we end up working with IT. Sometimes they don't care. Sometimes there's some territorial things going on, but it's not always IT, and
yeah,
IT department that does a bunch of other things.
Well, the other thing that you didn't mention this, but on those cold winter days, to have that nice server warming your legs under the desk. I mean, what do you do now? Do you have to bring a shawl or a blanket to work or something? I mean,
I just have them sit at my.
That's right.
But it's just so many great migrations. And like I said, I just love doing some of these because it's just so many crazy. One of the things that we've seen trends with is the third party things, and that's been fun because then I end up like, all right, so what is this CMS that you're using? Yeah, I've never heard of it. How do we export out of that? And then I get this big splat of whatever, and I'm like, okay, how do we make this look like SharePoint? So I'm writing PowerShell to do things. So those are kind of fun. You mentioned one of the other trends that I've seen is we are at the spot now where people have been in Office 365 long enough that mergers and acquisitions divestitures are happening. And I am currently looking at 2 or 3 different projects that are, doing those kind of things. And that is just something that we didn't deal with 5 years ago because there just wasn't enough people in Office 365. And now it's a thing.
Yeah, there's I mean, again, I look at all these things as tools and part of the larger change management of, within an organization. And so again, I look at migration not as a one time, but as an ongoing, a recurring activity, and it changes form a little bit. And so it makes sense to have somebody in the organization up to speed on what's happening. But obviously we have such a great, partner ecosystem, and yourself and your team there, of course, great to have out there. But so there's always people to ask questions. If you have any questions, I mean, highly recommend reach out to Todd. He's semi-personal, like he'll respond to stuff generally. You can reach him. That's right. You can reach out to him, but great person to answer questions about things. But yeah, very approachable, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
But I try to be, I wouldn't have gotten where I got without a bunch of people answering my stupid questions and
Yeah.
And that's, we talked about some of how things are changing. IT folks have had a real tough time figuring out their place in the cloud. I think we're kind of post that now, but I can tell you the things that I do as an IT admin now are way more fun than swapping out failed hard drive, power supplies, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That is just where I'm at in my career, but like, there's just not a lot of people that do that anymore. And that's
yeah. Let's always be, that's what comes with experience, is being able to go back and work on those projects that you be a little bit more pick and choose about those types of projects. But well, Todd, really appreciate you taking the time to walk down the memory lane with our SharePoint migrations.
Get it on the record, when you talk about SharePoint migrations, the good, the bad, and the ugly, I'm not the ugly, right? Realize
yeah.
Ahead of time, and they were a little cagey about where I fit in the good, the bad, or the ugly.
Yeah, I don't want to get caught up in all the semantics. We'll just I don't labels. That's right. Well, Todd, really appreciate you taking the time to join us. And of course, everybody, thank you for watching. If you've not already done so, then please subscribe to Office 365 Hours. And subscribing, we're not going to spam you with stuff. We'll send you the reminders of the shows, which happen on the first and third Wednesday of every month, always at, 11 a.m. Eastern. So thanks a lot, Todd. We'll talk to you soon.
My pleasure. Bye.